Good day. Today is Wednesday, 23rd April 2025, and today, Wednesday, was also supposed to be the day when the Europeans, the Americans, and the Ukrainians came together, adopted General Kellogg's plan, which would then be taken by President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow to be presented to President Putin. Well, I said in my previous programs that the Russians have already made it clear in many places and at many times that they're not prepared to accept the Kellogg plan. I discussed this all extensively yesterday, but I also said, and I've also said in many places, that the Ukrainians also would have strong issues with the Kellogg plan, even though in most respects, in fact in nearly all respects, it's probably the best resolution to the war that they can realistically hope to achieve at this time, and that it was not a foregone conclusion that they would accept it. Well, in the event, yesterday, before the talks today even began, the Ukrainians, President Zelensky himself, rejected the Kellogg plan outright and did so in the most extreme, and I have to say, I thought even insulting terms. I've discussed in previous programs how the Ukrainian delegation that was being sent to London would be headed by Andriy Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff. The Ukrainian defense and foreign ministers would also participate, but that it was interesting that Zelensky himself was not going. And I suggested, and I still believe, by the way, that that was at the wish of the Americans. Just as happened after the disastrous meeting between Trump and Vance and Zelensky in the Oval Office at the end of February, the Americans called the Ukrainians to a meeting on that occasion in Jeddah and made sure that Zelensky, who they have by now come to realize is a wrecker, they made sure that Zelensky would not attend that meeting. And out of that meeting, an apparent agreement by the Ukrainians for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire emerged. Well, it seems to me that the Americans tried to do the same thing with the meeting in London. They knew that Zelensky, before the meeting in Jeddah, would not agree to an unconditional ceasefire. Zelensky has repeatedly said that he's only interested in a ceasefire if he gets a security guarantee from the United States. In other words, a commitment by the United States to come to Ukraine's aid and defense if the Russians were to violate the ceasefire. And of course, as night follows day, Zelensky would then arrange for the ceasefire to be violated, would blame the Russians for the fact, and would demand assistance from the Americans. Anyway, Zelensky would not have agreed to the unconditional ceasefire proposal that came out of the meeting in Jeddah, and there was little likelihood that he would agree to the Kellogg plan, which was being put to the Ukrainians at the meeting that was supposed to happen today in London. This is because, despite the fact that the Kellogg plan is, frankly, very beneficial, or at least works strongly in Ukraine's interests at this time, Zelensky has consistently refused to walk back from any of the various demands he has been making right through the war, ever since the collapse of the Istanbul negotiations in April 2022. He continues to be committed to his so-called peace plan. This is a plan for the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from every millimetre of territory that Ukraine controlled on the 1st of January 2014, including Crimea. In other words, for the unconditional capitulation, military capitulation of the Russians, and then and only then there would be substantive negotiations, which would be negotiations not to decide the future orientation of Ukraine or larger security issues such as the security architecture of Europe or any of those sort of things. It would be negotiations about reparations to be paid by Russia to Ukraine, about war crimes trials of Russian officials, including perhaps President Putin himself, things of that kind. As for Ukraine's right to join NATO, Zelensky has made it clear that that is, as far as he is concerned, non-negotiable. He insists on it. He insists on Ukraine's right to build up Ukraine's armed forces to whatever size Ukraine can manage. He is not prepared to make any concessions whatsoever on the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. He's not prepared to make any concessions on the position of the Orthodox Church. None of that, as far as he is concerned, is open for discussion. And he is not happy with the Kellogg plan, because the Kellogg plan does three things that he doesn't like. Firstly, it leaves the Russians in control of significant territory in what, as far as Zelensky is concerned, is eastern Ukraine. Donbass, large areas of Zaporozhye, large areas of Kherson region, and of course Crimea. That, as far as Zelensky is concerned, is unacceptable. It also apparently provides for US recognition of Crimea as legally part of Russia. And again, Zelensky is adamantly opposed to that. As far as he's concerned, Crimea is Ukrainian, and the whole topic is not fit for discussion. Thirdly, the Kellogg plan does not provide for US security guarantees for Ukraine. There might be European security guarantees to Ukraine, security guarantees provided by Zelensky's friends in London, Paris, and Berlin. But Zelensky knows that without the United States, those security guarantees are worth little. And even though Kellogg clearly does envisage deployments of European troops to Ukrainian territory, Zelensky also knows that those troops, without an American guarantee behind them, cannot fundamentally change the military balance. So he wasn't happy with that either. There were other provisions about the Kellogg plan as it has evolved, which Zelensky also strongly disagrees with, as is so often the case when outsiders come to a conflict, particularly, if I may say so, Anglo-American outsiders who bring their own perspectives to what is fair and just to conflicts. The American proposal that the United States take over control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and operate the nuclear power plant on behalf of both the Russians and the Ukrainians was totally unacceptable to Zelensky as well. As far as he is concerned, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is Ukrainian and must be returned to Ukraine. Well, this time, Zelensky was not going to allow the same thing to happen as happened in Jeddah. He's never been really happy with the ceasefire, the unconditional ceasefire that the Ukrainians unwillingly agreed to at the meeting in Jeddah, this time before the talks in London had even begun. He made a speech in which, to all intents and purposes, he trashed the Kellogg plan. Ukraine will not recognize Crimea as part of Russia. Ukraine continues to consider all of the territory currently occupied by Russia in what Zelensky considers to be eastern Ukraine. It considers it to be Ukrainian, and it expects that that territory will be returned eventually to Ukraine. Ukraine categorically rejects any formula which leaves the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant outside Ukraine's control. Zelensky made a whole series of comments about NATO, and these have not been properly understood by the media in the West, or at least they haven't been properly reported there, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, Zelensky said, if Ukraine cannot join NATO, then what alternative security guarantee is it going to be given? What Zelensky actually means is that Ukraine must have security guarantees identical to NATO membership if it does not join NATO itself. That is Zelensky's way of saying that Ukraine really should join NATO. And of course, Zelensky says all of this in order basically to throw the whole question of NATO membership back to the Americans, and to make it absolutely clear that regardless of whatever Kellogg is saying about NATO membership for Ukraine being taken off the table, the Ukrainians will continue to press for NATO membership, because as far as they are concerned, that is the only guarantee that they can have that the United States will come to their defense again if they find themselves in another war with the Russians. So, in effect, Zelensky trashed the entire Kellogg plan. And he went further. He said that the Ukrainian delegation that is being sent to London would not discuss the Kellogg plan, had no mandate to agree to any part of the Kellogg plan. Its only mandate was to discuss a ceasefire, and that if a ceasefire was agreed, the kind of ceasefire that very unwillingly the Ukrainians agreed to at the meeting in Jeddah, well, if a ceasefire was agreed, then negotiations between Ukraine and Russia could begin, but without, of course, any time limit and without any guarantee of any kind of satisfactory outcome. So that, of course, goes completely against the Russian insistence that there must be some kind of commitment from the United States, from the Western powers, or Ukraine itself, as to what the final agreement should be. That looks to the Russians, and of course is, another device by the Ukrainians to go back to the Minsk formula, a formula whereby a supposed timetable and route map was set out for future negotiations to achieve a negotiated solution to what was at that time still an internal Ukrainian conflict, but one which the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian leadership used as a mechanism to spin things out as long as possible so that the Ukrainian military could be rebuilt in the way that Western leaders like Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, the two leaders who provided guarantees for the implementation of the Minsk agreement, those two leaders have agreed actually happened. So in effect, Zelensky wrecked the entire negotiation in London before it had even begun. He made it clear that Yermak and the foreign and defense ministers of Ukraine would not discuss the Kellogg plan, that there was no possibility, no chance that the Kellogg plan would be adopted as a result of that meeting, and no chance that Witkoff would be able to go to Moscow with the agreement to the Kellogg plan from the Ukrainians and the Europeans as well. So, what then happened was very interesting. Firstly, the meeting itself was, well, we were initially told that it had been downgraded to a meeting of officials when the Americans realized that Zelensky's people, his delegation, was not interested in negotiating or talking about or agreeing to the Kellogg plan. The two top US officials present, Rubio and Witkoff, quit the meeting. They gave their excuses and they left, leaving Kellogg, the original author of the Kellogg plan, to face the Ukrainians by himself. The departure of Rubio and Witkoff caused the British, the French, the Europeans also to scale down their representation at the meeting, so that it subsequently became, as we were told, a meeting purely by officials. But of course, there is another factor at play here as well, and that is that from a European point of view, given the extent of Europe's commitment to Ukraine, the extent of Europe's desire to keep the United States involved in the conflict in Ukraine, it is imperative that if the Kellogg plan is rejected, it should appear to have been rejected not by the Ukrainians, but by the Russians, so that it would be the Russians, not the Ukrainians, who would be blamed by Kellogg, other top American officials, and ultimately Trump himself for the failure of the Kellogg plan, which, to repeat again, is now clearly the official American plan to end the war. And the hope is that if that happens, if Trump and the Americans blame the Russians for the failure of the Kellogg plan, then the Americans will recommit to Ukraine. They will resume large shipments of weapons to Ukraine. They will resume economic assistance to Ukraine. They will continue to share intelligence with Ukraine. They will go back to the policy, in other words, of the Biden administration. And perhaps, possibly, they might escalate the economic war, the sanctions war against Russia as well. So it is essential. It was essential for the Europeans that it appeared that it was the Russians who were rejecting the Kellogg plan rather than the Ukrainians. And that explains an article that then appeared in the Financial Times, which caused a great deal of confusion for a short time. Now, the article was briefly the lead article in the Financial Times. After about a few hours, it was relegated to a lesser position. In fact, over the course of yesterday, it was interesting to see how it went from the lead article to being a less important article to being a still less important article. And today, though you can still find it if you search on the Financial Times website, it no longer appears, as of the time of making of this program, on the Financial Times front page. Anyway, this is what this article says. Vladimir Putin offers to halt Ukraine invasion US floats recognition of Russian annexation of Crimea as peace plan efforts continue. And then the article says the following. Vladimir Putin has offered to halt his invasion of Ukraine at the current front line as part of efforts to reach a peace deal with US President Donald Trump, according to people familiar with the matter. Now, that last formula, according to people familiar with the matter, immediately ought to raise alarm bells, because obviously we're not being told who these people are. We're not being told whether they are officials of any government, any particular government, whether they're diplomats, whether they're American or Russian or European or British or indeed Ukrainian, or whether quite possibly they might be journalists, reporters, academics, people, in other words, who are completely unconnected with any government, but who might be loosely defined as people familiar with the matter. Anyway, that's, as I said, the first warning. And then the article goes on to say, the Russian president told Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, during a meeting in St. Petersburg earlier this month, that Moscow could relinquish its claims to areas of 4 partly occupied Ukrainian regions that remain under Kiev's control, 3 of the people said. And we are then told that the US has since floated ideas for a possible settlement that includes Washington recognizing Russian ownership of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, the people added, as well as at least acknowledging the Kremlin's de facto control over the parts of the 4 regions it currently holds. The proposal is the first formal indication Putin has given since the war's early months 3 years ago that Russia could step back from its maximalist demands to end the invasion. Now, is any of this true? Now, I think the answer is clearly no. And it's not just because Russian officials, like none other than Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, have made it quite clear that Russia continues to insist on the transfer of the totality of the 4 regions to Russia as part of any peace agreement. And Lavrov has been speaking about this since the meeting between Witkoff and Putin, just saying. But there's also been confirmation already in the American media that Putin made that very same point clear to Witkoff when they did actually meet in St. Petersburg on the occasion referred to in this Financial Times article. Specifically, Bloomberg a couple of days ago said that there'd been a meeting at which Witkoff told Trump that the fastest way to end the conflict was to accept the Russian demand that the entirety of the 4 regions be transferred to Russia. And then Kellogg, who was also present at this meeting, pushed back and said that the Ukrainians would never accept a proposal like that, and that Trump heard the two out and then made no decision. So that was said after the meeting between Witkoff and Putin in St. Petersburg, and that basically tells us that at that meeting in St. Petersburg, Putin reiterated his position that the 4 regions must be transferred in their totality to Russia. Now, I've already said that I have information from a source who has access to information provided by the Kremlin to the Duma, to the Russian parliament, and this source has told me the same thing, that in the guidance provided by the Kremlin to the Russian parliament, the Kremlin has explained has confirmed that Putin continued to insist on the transfer of the 4 regions in their totality to Russia during his meeting with Witkoff in St. Petersburg. So why did this article appear? Well, it could be that these people, these mysterious people who are informed of the matter, aren't really very well informed of the matter, and that they just don't know what they're talking about, and that they probably have heard all kinds of things and are probably familiar with the American proposals and assume that Putin has agreed to them, which is not impossible. But I don't think so myself. Subsequently, further down in the article, there is a reference to European officials, and we're told that these European officials were briefed on US efforts to end the war, and that they cautioned that Putin would probably use the apparent concession as a bait to lure Trump into accepting Russia's other demands and forcing them on Ukraine as a fait accompli, which looks to me very much like indicating that these mysterious people who are informed of the matter are those same European officials. But that is a guess, and I'm not going to pretend that I know this for a fact. Anyway, this is what I think, and let me stress this is again my own theory here, though I think it's as good as any. But it seems to me that this article that appeared in the Financial Times, reporting a significant concession that Putin is supposed to have made to Witkoff, which all of the evidence coming out of Russia suggests Putin never made to Witkoff, was intended to cause the Russians to deny the story in the Financial Times. Now, had that happened, the Europeans would have been able to say, look, it's not just Zelensky who is rejecting the Kellogg plan, it's also the Russians. Why are we even here talking about all of these proposals that the Americans are coming up with? Zelensky himself is not really at fault here, because the Russians are refusing to give up their demands, their so-called maximalist demands for the 4 regions, and therefore that means that it is they, not Zelensky, who are ultimately responsible for the collapse of the negotiations. So this is what I think this was all about. It was, and the purpose behind it was to provoke an outright Russian denial of this whole story, a statement from the Kremlin that Putin never made that concession to Witkoff and that the whole story therefore is false. Well, shortly after this story in the Financial Times appeared, I think it's fair to say within an hour, the Kremlin did rush out an answer. But of course, it was much more nuanced than the answer that I think some people, the people who were behind this article, the people informed about the matter, might have anticipated. Because Peskov, Putin's spokesman, was contacted by one of the Russian news agencies, RIA Novosti, which is state-owned. So as I said, this was clearly an arranged statement. Anyway, Peskov did not straightforwardly say this story in the Financial Times is untrue. He said that you shouldn't believe everything you read because there's lots of fake information that is circulating, including information that appears in the most eminent newspapers and media publications. And it's quite clear that he was referring to this Financial Times article, which is after what he was being asked about, and that he's basically saying that the story is a fake. But even though that's clearly the meaning behind his words, he didn't straightforwardly say that the story is a fake, leaving it leaving it open for people perhaps to think otherwise, or perhaps, more to the point, keeping the focus on Zelensky as the man, the person who had wrecked the discussions in London, making it clear that it's not the Russians aren't involved, it's Zelensky and no one else who has rejected outright the Kellogg plan at this point, and that if you are angered and upset about that fact, then you should be angered and upset with him. Now, there will be many people who will discuss and comment about Zelensky's actions over the last 24 hours in their own ways. I've already seen articles appearing in, say, the Daily Telegraph that says that the Kellogg plan is a surrender to the Russians. There'll be no doubt attempts to say that Zelensky is heroically defending Ukraine's cause and that he is resisting American pressure. We were reading all of yesterday about the immense pressure that the Ukrainians were under to accede to the Kellogg plan, how they were in fact being presented with an ultimatum to accept the Kellogg plan, and that they bravely resisted that pressure, and Zelensky heroically resisted demands, in effect, for Ukraine's capitulation. Already that narrative is starting to be spun, and it is starting to appear, especially in Europe. Given that the reality is that the Kellogg plan, which incredibly, as it turns out, actually demands that Russia return some territory that it has captured to Ukraine, especially in Kherson region. Not a lot of territory, but some territory at least. An impossible demand for the Russians to accept. Given that the Kellogg plan is absolutely the best that Ukraine can possibly hope to achieve at this time, given that it is losing the war, I obviously don't agree with this view, this positive view of what Zelensky has just done. I have to say it, to me, it is a repeat on a larger canvas of the Oval Office episode all over again. Zelensky, on that occasion, came to Washington. He was supposed to agree to the mineral rights extraction deal. The Americans were putting some gentle pressure on him at that time to move towards a ceasefire. They asked him to turn up in a suit and tie as an indication that he was genuinely seeking peace. He threw that all out of the window. He came in his usual battle fatigues, if I can call them that. He was extraordinarily insulting to his American hosts. He continued to insist that Ukraine could not accept a ceasefire without security guarantees from the United States, that Ukraine should get security guarantees in return for agreeing to the mineral rights extraction deal. He used a particularly ugly word referring to Vice President Vance. He used it under his breath, but it was clearly audible and picked up by the microphones. He behaved extraordinarily, outrageously, in my opinion, over the course of that meeting in the Oval Office. And in effect, he's done the same thing all over again. He's told the Americans, look, I don't appreciate in any way what you're doing. I don't accept or agree with any of the things that you are doing. You must give me everything I want. And if you don't, well, the fault is entirely on you. To me, I have to say this, what happened yesterday, very much like what happened during that meeting in the Oval Office, came across as a tantrum by a spoiled child who is being denied his toys. It did not sound to me, it did not come across to me at all like the conduct of a leader, a statesman, responsible, acting responsibly for the long-term welfare of his nation and people. Just saying. What Zelensky, in essence, is demanding is that the United States win for him his war against Russia. He knows perfectly well that Ukraine cannot win the war by itself, but he insists that the United States is under some kind of obligation. Unclear what sort of obligation that is, but anyway, under some kind of obligation to win the war for him and for Ukraine on the conditions that he wants, which is Russia's total capitulation. And to get a sense of how extreme Ukrainian demands have become, well, it might be worth considering the latest demands that the Ukrainians are making of Germany, the other major arms supplier to Ukraine, set out by the former ambassador, Ukraine's former ambassador to Germany, Mr. Melnik, who has now been appointed Ukraine's permanent representative to the United Nations. And it is truly quite extraordinary. There's a good summary of all of this on Simplicius the Thinker's blog, but basically he is demanding, Mr. Melnik is demanding, and there's no reason to doubt that in this Melnik is being, in effect, Zelensky's voice. He is demanding that the Germans themselves go ahead and provide Ukraine with 86 billion euros of defense assistance between now and 2029. Then he also says that Ukraine should be given by the EU a further 372 billion euros by 2029, the rest of the EU. And then he also quite straightforwardly says that Ukraine should be given 550 billion euros in total in defense aid over the next 4 years, that is to say, by 2029. 550 billion euros, half a trillion euros between now and 2029 over 4 years. And he says that this would be a huge warning to Putin, which it certainly would be, but warning, which, well, I'm not even going to discuss what kind of a warning that is. But he also wants immediately 150 Taurus missiles, which of course the Germans would have to operate. As Simplicius the Thinker correctly points out, that is the entire arsenal of Taurus missiles that Germany possesses, which it turns out are actually operational. Germany has a stockpile of 600 Taurus missiles, but only a quarter of these are in an operational condition. So Melnik wants all of those to be provided to Ukraine now. And he also says that Germany should provide 30% of its fighter jets, 45 Eurofighters, 30 Tornadoes, 25 NH-90 TTH helicopters, and 15 Eurocopter Tigers. 30% of Germany's Air Force. I'm going to suggest that, again, that would mean the entirety of Germany's fighter jet force that is actually in a fully operating condition. And he goes on to say that the same 30% rule could also be introduced for other weapon systems from the Army's inventory in order to release the following critical deliveries: 100 Leopard 2 main battle tanks, 115 Puma and 130 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, 130 Boxers and 300 Fuchs armored transport vehicles, 20 Mars 2 rocket artillery systems with ammunition. That the Mars is the German adaptation of the American tracked multiple launch rocket system, out of which the HIMARS system emerged. And then he goes on to say that at the same time orders would be placed for a massive modernization of the Bundeswehr in order to quickly replace the weapon system supplied. So what Melnik, and as I said, he is now Ukraine's ambassador to the United Nations, is demanding is that Germany should supply the entirety of its operational equipment to Ukraine. And lastly, to cap it all, he wants Germany to help confiscate the 200 billion frozen Russian assets, which obviously should also be provided to Ukraine, which, if they are, well, that would mean that the total amount that Ukraine would receive over the next 4 years would be close to 700 billion euros, presumably of defense assistance. Now, one can treat this as comical, if you wish. Simplicius the thinker does, and to some extent. And it is indeed fantastical. But to me, again, what it demonstrates, just as what Zelensky's comments demonstrate, is this incredible, irrational, unreasonable sense of entitlement. Now, a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, when Putin was asked why do the Russians not come after Zelensky himself, I remember discussing this. Putin actually said in reply that there was no sense for the Russians in doing that because the Ukrainian leadership, and he was clearly referring to Zelensky, are irrational, and that removing Zelensky from the scene in that way, whilst there was a war ongoing, would simply might mean that Ukraine would replace an irrational leader with a much more rational one, who might be ultimately a much more dangerous adversary for Russia. Now, you could argue that the events of the last 24 hours confirm the validity of what Putin said. Putin, as a result of what Zelensky has done, if Witkoff does indeed go to Moscow this week, is not going to be presented with a Kellogg plan, which he would be bound to reject, but which Zelensky and the Ukrainians had accepted. So Putin is not going to have to go through he's not going to need to reject the Kellogg plan in that way, because at the moment, the Kellogg plan isn't a Ukrainian, it isn't even a formal proposal, since the Ukrainians have already rejected it. So, from Putin's point of view, this takes the weight off him. He isn't forced to reject something that he's bound to reject and that he really doesn't like. But I have to say this, eccentric though Zelensky often is, very often is, I'm not sure that any other Ukrainian leader would in fact ultimately behave very differently. Because this extraordinary sense of entitlement, this insistence on Ukraine's maximalist demands, and they generally are maximalist in this case, being fulfilled, they're maximalist because they are unachievable and unrealistic. That this insistence on maximalist demands being achieved appears to me to be true of the entire Ukrainian political system. Zelensky insists on this, but I remember that Poroshenko, the former president, who sometimes puts himself forward as a more reasonable alternative to Zelensky, it seems to me is fundamentally no different. I remember how at the time when the Minsk agreement was signed, at the meeting in Minsk in February 2015, it took hours for the joint efforts of the Germans, the French, and the Russians to get him to sign an agreement, the Minsk agreement, which he never had the slightest intention of ever honouring, as he has straightforwardly admitted himself. Even though he signed the leader statement, which committed him to see the Minsk agreement implemented, he straightforwardly said that his signature, as far as he was concerned, bound him to nothing. And in fact, even though he constantly pretended for years afterwards that he was indeed committed to the Minsk agreement, in reality, he went out of his way to sabotage it. I have heard nothing from Poroshenko to suggest that if he replaced Zelensky, his position would be any more reasonable or tractable than Zelensky's is. He might articulate his positions in more reasonably sounding ways. He might make statements that could be seen as indicating greater flexibility and a greater willingness to compromise, but I don't think there would be any truth behind them. And of course, the other person who has been talked about, Yulia Tymoshenko, well, she has in effect publicly accepted the Kellogg plan. She's talked about freezing the conflict on Korean lines, which is not that different from what the Kellogg plan is suggesting. But the result has been that she has become a marginalized figure in Ukrainian politics. And I think it is only people in the United States, some people in the United States, who believe seriously that she can become a leader of Ukraine again. So this attitude of Zelensky's is, in my opinion, an attitude common with the entire Ukrainian political class. Meanwhile, and I come back to what I've said in the past, even if I am wrong about this, I don't think it's going to be possible to get round Zelensky anyway, because I believe that the moment when it would have been possible to remove him from power has gone. There was an interesting article in The Economist, a publication that can in no possible way be described as pro-Russian or hostile to Ukraine. Anyway, there was an interesting article in The Economist recently, which, again, was very critical of Zelensky, admitted that the political situation in Ukraine today is, in effect, a wasteland, that Zelensky has systematically undermined and removed all of his political opponents, that he has achieved a complete monopoly of political power, and that in effect it is impossible to displace him. Moreover, by taking the stance that he is taking, Zelensky may be taking a position which is unpopular with wider Ukrainian society, not that that is ever easy to judge, but which is passionately supported by those people in Ukraine who have guns and who, in a political crisis, might be most likely to use them. And of course, I am referring to those people who are euphemistically referred to in the West as the far right, who are now well organized in various brigades and who have established a significant presence within Ukraine's security forces. And recently, the most prominent of these, the best known of these, the Azov Brigade, has been massively expanded, and an entire corps of Ukraine's National Guard, which, though it does engage in fighting on the battlefronts, is essentially an internal security organization. A whole corps of the National Guard has been created and built around one of the units of the Azov Brigade. So, very difficult to see how it would be possible to remove Zelensky from power through any internal coup. I know some people still float that possibility, but what might have been a relatively straightforward thing to do 1 or 2 years ago, it seems to me that the possibility of doing that has passed. Moreover, the further factor is that though the Americans by now can be under no illusions about what an impossible individual Zelensky is, and if they had any remaining doubts, if even Kellogg had any remaining doubts, then the events of the last 24 hours ought to disillusion them. I'm afraid in Kellogg's case, I doubt that it will, but they will, but that's another issue. But if the Americans had any doubts up to now and really had become disillusioned with Zelensky and had come to recognize fully what an impossible individual he is and how negotiating with him on anything but his terms is a completely hopeless exercise. Well, the Europeans are different. They continue to remain fully committed to Zelensky's cause. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has recently been speaking of his immense admiration for the Ukrainian army. He talks all the time about how the Ukrainian army has performed splendidly in the war and how their heroic struggle needs to be rewarded by a just and lasting peace. Kaja Kallas, the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Policy, has said, well, if the Americans recognize Crimea as Russian, that's up to them, but we never will. Other European officials never fail to express their admiration for Zelensky and for Ukraine's cause, and they continue to insist that support for Ukraine must be provided and that the only outcome, as Ursula von der Leyen wrote only recently, that the only outcome that is acceptable is a Ukrainian victory, which will supposedly put Ukraine in a stronger negotiating position with the Russians than it would otherwise be. A fatuous comment, by the way, but that is in fact what she wrote. And, well, those are her words. So, How does one get round the problem of Zelensky? He's not going to accept the Kellogg plan. He's made that absolutely clear. I don't think there should be any expectations that he will go back on that. On the subject of a ceasefire, he appeared to accept, because Yermak and the others in Jeddah did accept an unconditional ceasefire, and he harps on about that incessantly. But when he was offered ceasefires over the last few weeks, he rejected them, or rather he undermined them. There was the energy truce. Putin agreed to it. Zelensky initially seemed doubtful. Eventually, after intense pressure from the Americans and the Europeans, he appeared to come round. There is universal acceptance that Ukraine paid no attention to the energy truce and continued to launch drone strikes against Russian energy installations throughout the period of the energy truce. Ukraine was offered by the Russians, by Putin himself, a 30-hour ceasefire over the Easter holiday. The Russians have noted 5,000 violations of the ceasefire. We've now had more information about those violations, and I'm going to say it straight away. It turns out that they were much more significant and had much more significant consequences than Putin, who clearly doesn't want to be criticized for agreeing to a ceasefire that the Ukrainians were never going to honor, and which would result in significant losses for the Russians on the battlefronts. Anyway, the Ukrainian violations turned out to have been significantly more serious than Putin himself initially let on. So it's clear, for example, that the Ukrainians used the ceasefire. I say it's clear that the Russians say, but I have no doubt that this is true, that the Ukrainians used the ceasefire, the Easter ceasefire, to reoccupy at least part of the territory of the monastery, the village of Gornal in Kursk region, so that the Russians had to battle and fight in order to drive them out of the building of that monastery all over again. The Ukrainians used the ceasefire to recapture the village of Lochnia, an important village close to the Ukrainian supply lines in Sumy region. The Ukrainians also used the ceasefire to try to improve their positions in the Kupiansk region, but not apparently very successfully. And perhaps most striking of all, the Ukrainians used the Easter ceasefire. All of this information, I stress, comes from Russian sources, but it appears to be true. Anyway, the Ukrainians used the Easter ceasefire to regain lost ground in southwestern Donbass, in the areas near Novopavlivka and Bogatyr, where the Russians had previously made significant advances. So the Ukrainians may say that they are in favor of ceasefires, but in practical terms, they never are. The Europeans never criticized them for this. The Ukrainians have just sabotaged the Kellogg plan, but we see no real criticism of Zelensky. As a result of that, Zelensky behaved in an incredibly boorish way when he met with Vance and Trump in the Oval Office. All the European leaders came out and supported him. He's not going to change his stance. He's not going to shift his position on the Kellogg plan. He's going to insist on his demands being met. He's going to continue to work towards a situation where the United States becomes directly involved in the war against the Russians and wins it for him. He's now spreading more stories about Chinese involvement in the war. About a week ago, 2 weeks ago, he produced photographs of 2 Chinese soldiers and then claimed that this meant that China was supporting Russia, was directly involved in the war in some way, though the presence of 2 Chinese prisoners, who are almost certainly volunteers, in no way proves that. And he's been saying since then that China is now providing weapons to Russia. He's provided no evidence of this. Again, it's clearly an attempt to bait the Americans into becoming involved in the war. He is never going to change his stance, and he's never going to really pursue a policy of peace, and he is never going to compromise on Ukraine's demands, and he's never going to negotiate in good faith with the Russians. And as I said, I don't think he is removable. Now, we have been here before. President Thieu in Vietnam rejected all of the peace plans proposed by the Nixon administration in the early 1970s, and basically went on doing so until the eve of his departure from Saigon. President al-Ghani in Afghanistan did exactly the same. Zelensky is just the last in a succession of leaders, Ukrainian leaders, of leaders that the United States who are supported, who take these kind of dogmatic positions. And given that the Americans for the last 10 years have been giving the Ukrainians everything that they wanted, it's completely unsurprising that that is the stance that they will continue to take. Now, can I just say on this that one saw more of this expectation from the Ukrainians, that despite Donald Trump's Rubio's and Witkoff's and even Kellogg's statement, that this proposal that was made this week was the last chance, that if this wasn't settled this week, the United States would pull out of the negotiations. Well, Zelensky clearly doesn't believe that. And just as Thieu in Vietnam didn't believe that the Americans would pull the rug on him, finally, he assumed that if he took a hard line, they would always come back and recommit. And al-Ghani in Afghanistan appears to have believed the same thing. And in the case of Zelensky, he again made that pretty clear over the course of his speech yesterday. He said that there was no way that the Americans could simply walk out of the negotiation process in the way that they said. He seemed to think that the Americans were not serious about that, and that they would ultimately have to bend to his will because they cannot afford a straightforward defeat by the Russians in Ukraine. Now, here, the Americans, Donald Trump, face a serious test because, as I said, if the events of the last 3 months haven't confirmed that Zelensky, the Ukrainians, will never agree to a peace agreement on anything other than their own terms, and if the last 24 hours don't do that, I can't see what will. And besides, if the Americans come back and resume their efforts to negotiate and continue their support for Ukraine, then Zelensky will have every reason to believe in future that any American threats to pull out are simply a bluff, and he will dig in his heels even further. So the Americans now have to make that decision. Do they finally do that which they said they would do over the course of the last couple of days? If there isn't a peace agreement agreed this month, which it's now impossible to see how it can be, finally pull the plug from the whole business, pull out entirely, cease to provide military aid, cease to engage in mediation efforts? Or do they go back on all of that, restart the whole fruitless process of negotiations all over again, in which case, exactly as they themselves have said, they will get bogged down and this whole process will go on forever and lead nowhere? The decision ultimately rests with Donald Trump. It seems to me that he now has the option to pull out. J.D. Vance, who's just been in India, by the way, trying to negotiate a trade agreement there, he says it's going well, but then, of course, the Americans always say that all their negotiations are going well until it turns out that they are not. But I'm not going to discuss that here. Anyway, J.D. Vance has made statements over the course of the last 24 hours, which make it pretty clear to me that he thinks that this is the moment when the United States should indeed pull out of the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, he has been perhaps the strongest skeptic in Washington of America's commitment to Ukraine all along. Just saying. But I have to say that I suspect that there will continue to be voices in Washington that will continue to tell the president that he can't pull out, that he's got to continue to commit to Ukraine, that he can't give up his negotiating efforts now, that doing so would hand a victory to the Russians, and that would be unacceptable. That would be unacceptable, and it would be too much of a blow for the United States to accept. There is an excellent article about all of this by Alistair Crook, the former British diplomat, on the Conflicts Forums Substack. And in it, he says this. He says this. Is Trump really going to wash his hands of Ukraine? Doubtful, given that the US neoconservative institutional established leadership will tell Trump that to do so would weaken America's peace through strength narrative. Trump may adopt support on a low-flame posture while declaring the war was never his, as he seeks a win on the business front with Russia. And anyway, I think that's probably what is going to happen. He's going to probably now decide to move forward with some kind of negotiation with the Russians for full normalization of relations. He's already boxed himself in by basically saying that sanctions against Russia cannot be lifted until there is peace in Ukraine. A major mistake, in my opinion, but one which has been repeated by the State Department and which I don't think he can easily walk back. So there it is. That, I think, is most likely what he's going to do. But one way or the other, I think he should, if he can't completely cut the connection to Ukraine, he should at least from this moment on distance himself from it. He should also stop listening to General Kellogg. And I say that, I don't mean to suggest that General Kellogg is not in his own way a well-intentioned man, well-intentioned on what he believes to be America's behalf and even Donald Trump's behalf. But I don't think he has served either America's or Trump's interests well with the plan that he has presented. Again, Alistair Crook goes through all of that in his article. He says that Kellogg appears to have made implicit assumptions that the Russians were highly vulnerable to sanctions and were exhausted on the battlefields, that none of that has been true, that he has led Trump down a blind alley by presenting a plan which the Russians were bound to reject, but which, of course, Zelensky, whose probable acceptance of his plan Kellogg may have taken for granted, but which Zelensky has also now rejected. So I think that Trump needs to stop listening to Kellogg. Perhaps, given that Kellogg is an elderly man, he's 80, the time has come to tell him that his services, though they've been hugely valued, have now basically come to an end. And for Trump, as I said, to remove himself and the United States, certainly from the negotiations, and perhaps to downscale US military aid to Ukraine and to leave it to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans from this point on. I don't think that he can pursue further economic deals with the Russians for the time being. So there it is. I cannot see any way back from the Kellogg plan from this point onward. It could be that over the summer, as Ukraine's military position collapses, the Europeans start to put pressure on the Americans again, either to resume negotiations or to step up military aid to Ukraine or something of that kind. But by that time, with the Russians almost certainly having advanced further, it will be too late for Kellogg's plan, which was never realistic anyway. In my opinion, the events of the last 24 hours have finally and conclusively vindicated the stance that Alex Christoforou and I took back in the summer when we said that the best thing for Donald Trump to do after he was elected president was to simply say that this was not his war, that the United States had done all that it could, and to leave it to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans by themselves to sort it out. Instead, listening to Kellogg and perhaps Rubio and Waltz, he's tried first to get a ceasefire, which hasn't happened, and then to get Kellogg's plan accepted by the Ukrainians and the Russians. On all counts, this has failed. It's simply taken up time and resources and led to embarrassment, and the moment has definitely come to call a stop. I doubt that Trump will fully do it for the reasons that Alistair Crook has said, but we'll see. Anyway, having come to this point, perhaps it's worth saying a few things about the military situation before I finally wrap up this video. Briefly, the Russians continue to advance. They have apparently definitely pushed the Ukrainians now out of the territory of the monastery. They're fighting for the village of Gornal itself. They have apparently continued to advance on all sides around Pokrovsk. There's been statements about this from, I believe it was Kimakovsky, one of the Russian officials, about how all the Ukrainian counterattacks around Pokrovsk have been a failure, and how the Russians are advancing north of Kotlino and are also advancing to the northeast of Pakrovsk as well. The situation around Pakrovsk is looking very, very difficult for the Ukrainians, and I would not be surprised if we see a sudden collapse in Pakrovsk at some point over the next couple of weeks. Not that difficult from the collapse that suddenly happened in Selidovo a few months ago. Meanwhile, there are further reports of what does increasingly look like a major operational crisis for the Ukrainians in the area of Konstantinovka. Sukhye Balka, the main Ukrainian military village, which is the main Ukrainian military position, immediately to the south of Konstantinovka, has now been captured, and we have conclusive evidence of this. The Russians are now clearing the territory to the east and west of Torezk, which does appear to be securely under their control. It will probably take some weeks, but at some point, a continuous front line will be established immediately south of Konstantinovka. And the Ukrainian positions, the Ukrainians continue to cling on to a few high points around Chasiv Yar, but I suspect that continuing to cling on to those, as everything else around them collapses, is going to prove extremely difficult. All the conditions point to a future collapse of Ukrainian positions around Konstantinovka and a likely assault on Konstantinovka sometime in the early summer, perhaps in parallel with an attack on Pakrovsk. Meanwhile, we're getting more information about Russian drone strikes and more information about the Uranium-3 drone that I mentioned or spoke about yesterday. It seems as if the Uranium-3 drone has a small jet engine in place of the former turboprop engine that the Uranium-2 drone uses. So the Uranium-3 can apparently fly at much higher speeds, around 500 kilometers an hour, and at much higher altitudes than the Uranium-2 drone. It is vulnerable, or so I read, to attacks by infrared-guided man-pads anti-aircraft missiles. But as the Russians are pointing out, it actually costs significantly less than man-pads missiles, which are anyway in short supply in the West. And so for the Ukrainians to try to shoot them down with those would be a complete waste of time. It is out of reach of Ukrainian guns, heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft guns, which the Ukrainians have previously used to shoot down Uranium-2 drones. And in the meantime, the Russians have developed a whole new, incredibly complicated menagerie of new drones and weapons of that kind that they are using all across the battlefronts. I'm gradually losing count of what these are. The Lancet, for example, which became so important in 2023 in repelling Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, has now evolved into a very complex family of different drones, but there are all sorts of other drones being used by the Russians, and the Russians are becoming more sophisticated in their use of drones every day. And, well, there's also been a major fire at an ammunition dump in Russia, in Vladimir region. There's no suggestion that this was caused by Ukrainian military action. It appears to have been caused by negligence on the part of the Russian custodians of this ammunition dump. There is so much ammunition and explosives now all over Russian territory that it's unsurprising that these events happen. But perhaps again, what this incident does is highlight just how vast Russian ammunition production has now become, as illustrated by General Syrsky's recent admission that in the summer and autumn, the Russian firing rate, artillery firing rate, was 40,000 rounds a day, and that after a quieter period in the winter, it is now rising again and is close now to 30,000 rounds a day. Even as the Ukrainian firing rate, which perhaps peaked in the winter at around 10,000 rounds a day, might be soon declining. So anyway, the Russians continue to make progress, continue to position themselves around the important towns on the eve of the big hammer blow that everybody now expects to come in the early summer or late spring. But I won't say conclusively that negotiations to end the war are now dead. But after Zelensky's outburst and the collapse of the talks in London, it seems to me that a military resolution of this conflict is now all but certain. And of course, many will say that in a war of this kind, that is the only logical outcome to this war. Well, this is where I finish today's program. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Stars by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.